Before I get started telling you about the worst night of my life, which was actually supposed to be the best night of my life, I have to give you a little bit of backstory to make it make sense. You see, the man I ended up marrying is the exact opposite of the men I dated in my younger years. I'm not ashamed to say that I'm a recovered drug addict, but that should also tell you something about the people I used to hang around and, at some points, date. I wasn't raised in the nicest of neighborhoods, and I didn't have the kind of parents that cared what I did or where I went. I was lucky if I came home and there was actually food in the fridge. I ended up dropping out at 14 and moving in with my boyfriend at the time. He was 23. Yeah, I know what you're all thinking. A 23-year-old with a 14-year-old girl is gross and in no way okay. But I was 14. I thought it was cool that an older guy wanted to be with me. My parents didn't even question where I was going when they saw me moving things out of the house, so I just figured everything was fine. My friends from school kept telling me not to move in with him, but I thought they were just jealous. So I did it anyway and cut all of them out of my life. Now, we'll call this guy that I moved in with Danny. Danny was a meth addict. I say was, but honestly, I'm 99% sure that he still is. The house I moved into was completely disgusting, with rotting floors, mold everywhere, and random people coming in and out all day and during all hours of the night. Part of me regretted moving in with him, but I was stubborn and didn't want to prove my friends right. Besides, life with Danny was fun, or so my 14-year-old self thought. We would smoke all the time. He got me whatever I wanted, by shoplifting, of course, and he was nice to me. Well, not actually nice to me. He would compliment me and tell me how amazing I was and that he loved me, but at the same time, he would hit me whenever he got high. He always apologized after, and I always forgave him. After all, I had nowhere to go, and he always reminded me that no one would ever love me as much as he did. Well, I bet you can guess what happened next. I eventually got hooked on meth. I was 15 when he first asked me if I wanted to try it. I said no a few times, but he kept pressuring me and begging me just to try it, and I finally gave in. I couldn't describe the exact feeling to you even if I wanted to. All I knew was that I needed to feel that feeling again. I think I finally realized I had a problem about a year in when I couldn't stop. I had to have it. I couldn't even go half a day without getting high, and it was all I thought about, and it completely consumed me. One day, I ran into one of my childhood friends who was a few years older than me at the store when I was about 18 years old. She just gasped when she saw me. Her mouth was wide open as she stared at me, and I knew why. I looked horrible. My teeth were rotting, my hair was disgusting, the clothes I wore were ratty. I was gross, and I have no problem admitting that. It is what it is. When she finally managed to speak, all she said was, "What happened to you?" At that moment, all I felt was shame. I wanted to shrivel up in a little ball and disappear. We actually ended up talking for a few hours that day, and for some reason, I told her everything that had happened in the few years since we last talked. She listened to me, hugged me, and told me that she wanted to help me. Her husband worked at a rehabilitation center, and she was sure that she could get me in if I was willing. I honestly didn't think that I was ready for that, but I also knew that I probably would never be ready. I had this opportunity right in front of me to get help, and I knew so many people didn't have that, so I took it. I agreed to go to rehab. I left Danny that night, and when he found out where I was going, anger didn't even begin to cover how he felt. He beat me, threw all my stuff on the grass outside the house, lit it on fire, and told me dying was the only way I would ever be rid of him. I said nothing. I called my friend, and she and her husband were at the house in just under 10 minutes. Danny screamed and yelled as I got in the car. As we were driving away, he told me my life would be nothing without him. I left and I never looked back. I got through rehab and have been clean for the past 10 years. I won't lie to you and tell you that it's been easy, it hasn't. I was instructed by one of my therapists in rehab to move out of state so I wouldn't be surrounded by the same people and places that influenced me in the first place. So, I did as she said and moved to Montana. I went back to school, got my GED, and eventually went to college and graduated with a teaching degree. I got a job at the local elementary school teaching history and met the man I now call my husband. I never knew that I could be so happy, that a man could treat me so well, but there I was, the happiest I'd ever been in my life, with a stable job and in a serious, incredible relationship. When he asked me to marry him, I was overjoyed. I was so excited. I began planning immediately, and of course, the guest list would be on the small side, but that wasn't important. I was just happy to be getting married to the man of my dreams. The day the wedding rolled around, I was nervous, not cold feet nervous, just nervous and excited for the day and hoping that it would be as amazing as I thought it would be. I was wrong, and I'll tell you why. The ceremony went perfectly. We said our vows, everyone cried, including me, and it was amazing. It was everything I had dreamed of and more. Then came the reception. We booked a fairly small outdoor venue and paid to have those big party tents set up in case it started to rain and we would still be covered. People began making their toasts, and when the time came, my husband and I began our first dance together as husband and wife. As I held on to my husband's arm while we swayed to the music, I swore I was going crazy when I saw him. I knew it had to be a dumb joke my mind was playing on me, but it was no joke. He was really there, and I froze, terrified, as I watched him make his way toward me carrying something that was covered by a blood-soaked towel. I couldn't speak. I don't know why I couldn't, but no words would come out no matter how much I tried. Maybe it was a panic attack, but either way, I was desperately looking around at other people, hoping they noticed what was scaring me so bad. My husband was whispering something in my ear, but I couldn't even hear him. Everything was being tuned out, and the only thing I could focus on was Danny getting closer and closer to me with every step he took. Finally, someone noticed, and I was relieved when I saw my husband's brother get out of his seat and physically stop Danny from getting any closer to me. And that's when he did it. He uncovered what he was carrying and threw it right in my face. It hit me hard. Whatever it was heavy and wet and hit me with so much force I was on the ground in seconds. I couldn't believe what was happening. I looked down and noticed that I was covered in blood. The room started spinning, and I started hyperventilating. I could hear Danny screaming, but at that point, I couldn't focus enough on anything to tell what he was saying, and finally, I just passed out. When I woke up, I was in the back of an ambulance, getting my dress cut off so they could look for wounds. They weren't exactly sure if the blood was mine or if it all came from the pig's head. Yes, you read that right, Danny had actually thrown a severed pig's head directly at my face. I had a few cuts on my face from where the head hit me and had unfortunately swallowed some of the blood that had forced its way into my mouth on impact. My husband apparently insisted I be taken to the hospital to test for any diseases I may have gotten from it. After I passed out, a bunch of men in my husband's family tackled Danny to the ground and beat him severely until he was bloody and unconscious. When the police got there, they also just ended up taking him to the hospital as well, where he was treated for internal injuries from the beating. I was fine apart from the mental trauma and a couple of scrapes and bruises from where I was hit. My husband and I had a second ceremony a few months later, much smaller, at his parents' house to try to make up for the day that had been ruined for both of us, and it was perfect. It's just how I wanted my wedding day to be remembered. Now, Danny was sentenced to 5 years in prison with 5 years probation after his eventual release. I was relieved when I heard how long his sentence was. The mental trauma that I have has been awful, but my husband always makes me feel safe. He assured me that he would never let anything happen to me like that again, and I believed him. It wasn't his fault. We've been married now for 5 years, and I figured I'd tell this story now as Danny is set to be released in the coming months. Lately, all I do is pray to God that he isn't mad enough to pull something like that again or do something even worse. I live in a safe town, the kind of town where you can leave your car doors unlocked. Hell, you can usually get away with leaving the doors to your house unlocked. The crime rate is very low, and I live on a dead-end block. I had just gotten home from work around 7 p.m. after a 10-hour shift and was preparing a late dinner when the phone rang. The second I picked up, I heard the sound of the person on the other end hanging up. I don't know if this has any correlation with what's to come, but if it does, that's even more horrifying. On nights when I get home late, especially after 10-hour shifts, usually I'll just cook, eat, clean up, take a shower, then lay in bed watching TV for an hour before going to sleep. This was one of those nights. I was physically and mentally exhausted, which led me to making what I learned that night was a serious mistake. I was laying in bed watching One Piece for my third run. Sometimes I'll drift off to sleep with the TV still on when I'm just completely beat, and that's exactly what happened this night. I woke up to the TV still playing the One Piece. I had slept through 2 episodes. I felt around the bed for the remote and turned it off. In the now freshly silent room, I was able to hear little creaks in the wood under the carpet. I felt adrenaline kick in as I looked across the dark room. I felt I could vaguely see the shape of a very wide figure. As I aimed the remote at the TV to turn it back on to light up the room, before the TV was even on, I started choking on my own spit as I tried to say, "Please leave." The TV came back on, and the room lit up a tint of blue, revealing this woman in a wedding dress looking at me with the veil covering her face. I tried to scream at first, but nothing came out of my mouth because I was just in pure shock. I sat up, pressed against the headboard of my bed, frozen. That's the best way I can describe what I was doing in that moment. The woman in the dress, whose face I could barely see, walked over to the bed whispering, "Where is my groom?" over and over, but each time she said it, she got louder. Her whisper quickly turned to a yell, and she grabbed the edge of my mattress and started shaking it. I screamed back at her to leave me alone. Then I got off the bed, pushed her, and ran to the bathroom across the hall and locked the door. She followed me, trying to open the door, banging on it and repeating the words, "Where's my groom?" I yelled at her, "I'm calling the cops," and luckily I had my cell phone on me. The woman was crying now on the other side of the door, still knocking and banging. The last thing I heard her say was, "I have to get to my wedding." I heard her stomp down my stairs, screaming and crying. Then I heard the front door slam shut. I was on the phone with 911, and I explained what just happened. I checked the living room, and she was gone. I stepped outside to see if I could see which way she ran, but she was out of sight. A police officer showed up shortly, and I described her as some larger woman in a white wedding dress and veil, how she was screaming, "Where's my groom?" and "I have to get to my wedding." I couldn't help with the direction she ran to. It was either down the only direction the street goes or the woods to the right. Because of my exhaustion after my 10-hour shift, I had forgotten to simply lock my door, something I honestly never even thought was a problem in my neighborhood. But this just goes to show that even in the best of neighborhoods, you're not always safe from crazy people out there. I think this woman was off her rocker and belonged in a mental asylum, and I hope police or somebody found her roaming the streets that night and brought her somewhere to get her help. Weddings are stressful. Too stressful. I just wanted to elope, but my wife refused. She wanted a huge, all-out, super expensive wedding, and even though I could afford it, that was literally my nightmare. I guess she and I were the opposite of each other, but the term opposites attract really did apply in this situation. I had never loved anyone the way I loved her. Anyways, I agreed to the extravagant big wedding on one condition: I got to pick the food. She didn't like that at all, but I stood my ground and told her that it was the only way that she would get what she wanted. Eventually, she agreed, and that started the journey of trying to find the perfect food for the big day. I knew that it had to be something to cheer me up, given the whole day was going to be the opposite of how I'd hoped. I went to multiple restaurants that served all different types of food, but choosing was proving to be a lot harder than I had planned. About a week before the wedding, my soon-to-be wife, Ella, asked me what I had ended up choosing for the wedding. My heart sunk, and I could feel my face getting red when I realized that I had completely forgotten to make a decision at all. I couldn't even look at her when she asked me a second time after I failed to respond to her. I knew she knew, though. After her fourth time asking, my fourth time not saying anything, she lightly slapped my shoulder and, with a voice that could stop traffic, said, "You didn't make a decision and reserve a caterer, did you?" I was so embarrassed, but I also wasn't about to prove her right. I was stubborn, and her need to be right all the time was almost as important as my need to prove her wrong whenever I could when it came to little stuff like this. I looked her in the eyes and as calmly as I could informed her that I had decided that we'd be eating Thai food on the night of our wedding. She seemed unsure about my answer, but that seemed good enough to get her off my back for the time being. She made it clear that she wasn't too pleased about my choice in food, but she didn't think that I would come through at all, so she was just happy that I chose something. That night, I told her that I'd be joining her in bed a little late because I had some stuff to attend to. In reality, that whole night was spent searching for a last-minute Thai caterer that hopefully I could call in the morning and book for the wedding. When morning came, I called 5 different Thai restaurants and asked if they could do it. They all said no, but the last one gave me the phone number to his aunt and said that she made great Thai food, and he was 90% certain that she could prepare enough food for the wedding with her family's help. I was skeptical at first, but I had no other options. There was no way I was going to tell Ella what was actually going on, so I called her. She told me she could do it, but it would cost around $10,000 for the short notice and the amount of food that she'd be making. It was a large wedding, and she told me that she'd have to get her brothers, sisters, and children on board with cooking to be able to finish it in time. After we hung up, I was actually pretty optimistic. The big day came, and I can't lie and say that I wasn't dreading it. I knew Ella would love it, but I also knew that I would hate it. But I was willing to do anything for her, even put up with the wedding and reception that were the opposite of what I would have wanted. The Thai food was dropped off at the reception venue early in the morning, and the wait staff was instructed on how to go about serving and reheating it. When I went to check on how everything worked out, it looked amazing. My wife even commented on how proud of me she was for coming through with what I had promised. It was time to eat, and everyone really enjoyed the food. It was worth the huge expense, and I felt pretty good about myself at that moment. But that feeling wouldn't last. After around 6 hours since the food had been served and toward the end of the reception, my wife came to me complaining of an upset stomach and told me that if I needed her, she'd be in the restroom. I figured it was a coincidence that my sister had come to me complaining of the same thing too, but I brushed it off. I could only brush it off for so long, though, until my own stomach began to hurt. I started to sweat, I became nauseous and was desperate to find the bathroom. When I found it, I realized other people were having the same problem too. The line for the bathroom was at least 30 people long, and it just kept getting longer by the second. Even the porta potties outside had lines. That's when it began. I watched in horror as almost everyone who was attending the reception began to projectile vomit in every direction. These people were so sick and weren't even trying to aim away from each other. There were literally hundreds of us filling this venue, throwing up in every direction. It was covering the floors, the walls, the tables. The large room filled with the stench of the insides of people's stomachs. It was so bad, I remember my eyes began to water and my nose was even burning. I felt myself needing to throw up as well, and before I knew it, I was adding to the pool of sludge under my feet. It was like a scene from a terrible horror movie, and for a second, I thought maybe I was having a nightmare. At some point, someone ended up calling an ambulance, and most people that had become sick elected to be taken to the hospital. I knew what had happened though. I immediately knew it was food poisoning, and I didn't need a doctor to tell me that buying food from a random Thai lady who cooks in her own home maybe wasn't a good idea. I had unintentionally poisoned all these people. I couldn't help but feel bad as all these sick people were carted off to the hospital. Most ended up actually testing positive for E. coli. Some spent a good amount of time in the hospital and some went home that same day, but the outbreak was so big that I had to fess up. I told the police exactly what had happened. Unfortunately, some of the wedding guests most affected by the food poisoning did opt to sue. Myself, my wife, and the woman who cooked the food were held responsible for what had happened that night and were ordered to pay a large amount of money, which I won't disclose here, to the large list of guests that joined the lawsuit against us. The woman who cooked for us and her whole family were found to be illegal immigrants and were subsequently deported after their immigration status became known. My wife wouldn't even look at me for almost a week and wouldn't sleep in the same bed as me for almost a year. For a while there, I thought that she was going to divorce me for what I did. It's been around 6 years now and I learned my lesson. I feel extreme guilt every day for what had happened. I really should have just let my wife make the decisions. Being stubborn really doesn't pay off. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.